The first memo arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, which is how most things arrived at City Hall, not with thunder or warning bells, but as an attachment in an email nobody had time to read properly. I remember the rain against the windows of the planning department, the clean gray shine of Douglas Street below, the umbrellas moving like small dark animals along the sidewalk, and the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the kitchenette where someone had once taped up a sign asking people not to abandon half-empty mugs in the sink, a request which had failed as completely as most requests made in government buildings. My name is Byron Wilkerton, and at the time I was a senior planner with the city of Victoria, which meant I spent my days thinking about bicycle lanes, housing density, shoreline setbacks, emergency access routes, heritage facades, sewage capacity, public consultation schedules, and the long, dull, fragile future we all pretended could be managed if only the maps were updated regularly enough. The memo came from Emergency Management BC, copied to municipal planners, port authorities, procurement officers, transportation coordinators, and several people whose titles were so long they seemed less like jobs than defensive fortifications. The subject line read, Preliminary Advisory, Accelerated Marine Hull Degradation Event. I opened it between two meetings, expecting another environmental compliance notice, perhaps something about invasive mussels or dry dock maintenance delays, and I skimmed the first paragraph with the usual partial attention of a man who has learned that most urgent government emails are only urgent to the person who wrote them. There had been reports, it said, of rapid structural deterioration in commercial vessels operating in warm Pacific waters. Microscopic marine organisms had been observed colonizing hull surfaces, weld seams, rudder assemblies, ballast intakes, and exposed reinforcement points. The degradation rate was described as anomalous. That word appeared 3 times in the first page, and I remember disliking it immediately because anomalous was the kind of word people used when they did not want to write impossible. At 9 o'clock, I attended the Interdepartmental Growth Coordination meeting in room 4B, where we discussed missing middle housing, anticipated school enrollment pressure, and whether the public engagement session for the North Park redevelopment should include printed boards or only digital slides. Nobody mentioned the hull organism. At 10:30, I joined a call with provincial transportation staff about ferry terminal access and pedestrian improvements near Belleville Street. Nobody mentioned it there either, though one of the engineers from the ministry sounded distracted and twice asked people to repeat questions he had clearly heard. At noon, I ate a turkey sandwich at my desk while reading the rest of the memo, and that was when the first small unease moved through me. Not fear exactly, but the faint internal shift a planner feels when a line on a map stops representing what it used to represent. The organism had no approved common name yet. It had been detected first in the South China Sea, then off Indonesia, then along sections of the Indian Ocean trade routes, then in several ports on the Pacific coast of South America. Early photographs showed pale, thread-like colonies spreading beneath marine coatings in lace patterns fine enough to look almost beautiful. The colonies secreted acids, enzymes, or something not yet confidently identified, and those secretions weakened steel, aluminum alloys, composites, protective paints, epoxies, seals, and certain ceramic coatings. Vessels were being pulled from service for inspection. Several had been declared total losses. 2 bulk carriers had suffered flooding from hull breaches in calm water. The memo stressed that there was no immediate threat to British Columbia ports. It also advised municipalities to review supply chain dependencies as a precautionary exercise. That phrase stayed with me for years, as a precautionary exercise. It sounded so sensible, so bloodless, so Canadian. Review dependencies, identify critical imports, coordinate with regional partners, maintain situational awareness. There was no sentence in that memo that said the world was ending, and perhaps that was why I kept reading it. Governments do not say the world is ending. Governments say conditions are evolving. They say additional guidance will follow. They say stakeholders should prepare to participate in scenario-based planning. They say there is currently no cause for public concern, which is often true at the exact moment it is written and less true by the time anyone reads it. By late afternoon, the rain had thickened over the harbor, and from the fourth-floor windows, I could see the cranes at Ogden Point standing in the mist, their long arms motionless against the low sky. They had always looked permanent to me, less like machines than civic facts. The city had grown around the assumption that goods would continue arriving from elsewhere, that ships would cross oceans, that containers would be lifted and stacked and trucked and opened, that grocery shelves would refill, that medical equipment would appear when ordered, that construction materials would come from wherever construction materials came from, that replacement parts would move invisibly across the planet until they reached a receiving bay behind some building where a clerk with a barcode scanner would confirm that civilization had functioned once again. As planners, we rarely spoke of that assumption directly. We spoke instead of transportation networks, economic resilience, climate adaptation, land use, growth projections, housing targets, infrastructure renewal, and fiscal constraints. We spoke in layers. Beneath every layer was the sea. The first time anyone said the word crisis aloud was 3 weeks later in a windowless boardroom at the regional district office, although even then it was cushioned inside other words. "Emerging marine logistics crisis," said a deputy assistant director from the province, a tired woman named Charlotte Muir, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the practiced calm of someone who had spent 20 years delivering bad information to people who wanted better information. Around the table were representatives from Victoria, Esquimalt, Saanich, Oak Bay, the Harbor Authority, BC Ferries, Island Health, the airport, the police department, Public Works, Emergency Management, Procurement, and 2 federal observers who said very little and wrote constantly in notebooks. I sat between our transportation planner and a facilities manager who smelled faintly of sawdust and hand sanitizer. A screen at the front of the room showed a map of global shipping routes with red dots spreading across the oceans like a rash. Charlotte explained that hull degradation was now affecting vessels in multiple climates and that the organism, or family of organisms, had shown unexpected adaptability to temperature, salinity, light levels, pressure, and anti-fouling treatments. The scientific advisory group had not yet determined whether it was newly evolved, newly dispersed, or newly noticed. Someone asked whether it could be killed. Charlotte said treatment protocols were under review. Someone asked whether it could reach Canadian waters. Charlotte said detection teams were monitoring. Someone asked whether shipping companies could route around affected zones, and Charlotte changed slides. That was how I learned to recognize the shape of an answer no one wanted to give. She showed us insurance data, dry dock backlogs, freight delays, port closures, quarantine procedures, emergency inspections, projected repair capacity, and global vessel utilization. The charts were professional and dreadful. Lines fell where they should have risen. Lines rose where they should have remained flat. Every number seemed to suggest another number not shown on the slide. There were no corpses in the presentation, no burning cities, no screaming crowds, only percentages and timelines, and the quiet implication that the planet's circulatory system had developed an infection no surgeon could reach. When the lights came back on, nobody spoke for a moment, and in that silence I heard the building itself. The ventilation system, the hum of fluorescent lights, rain ticking somewhere in a drainpipe, the small click of a pen being capped. Then the questions began, and because we were government people, they were procedural questions. Who would lead municipal coordination? Would there be a provincial template for dependency inventories? Were food and fuel projections confidential? Should elected officials be briefed before or after the preliminary analysis? Was public messaging centralized? Could we use existing emergency planning structures, or would a new task force be required? Did this fall under climate adaptation, economic development, transportation resilience, or emergency management? The federal observers kept writing. I did not speak until Charlotte asked the planners directly to identify land use vulnerabilities related to port disruption, and even then my answer sounded ordinary enough to disappoint me. I mentioned food distribution sites, fuel storage, emergency access corridors, warehouse zoning, local agriculture limitations, repair yards, temporary housing for displaced workers, and the need to review industrial land protection. I could hear myself talking as though I were narrating someone else's competence. My voice was calm. My notes were organized. I used phrases like medium-term scenario planning and critical supply continuity. Yet, somewhere beneath the table, in the part of me that had not been trained to speak in administrative language, another thought moved slowly and coldly through the dark. Victoria was on an island. We had spent decades softening that fact with ferries, barges, container ships, air cargo, just-in-time logistics, and the comforting illusion that water was connection rather than separation. But water had always been both. The organism had not changed geography. It had merely reminded us what geography meant. By Christmas, the harbor still looked normal to anyone who did not know how to read absence. The coho came and went. Ferries moved. Fishing boats rocked in their berths. Tourists took pictures in front of the legislature beneath strings of holiday lights. Government offices emptied for the season with the usual mixture of relief and unresolved tasks postponed into January. But shipping schedules were already slipping in ways that showed up first not as shortages, but as substitutions. A project manager complained that the light fixtures specified for a municipal building upgrade were unavailable and that the supplier could offer a similar model in 8 to 14 weeks. A contractor asked whether imported paving stones could be replaced with domestic concrete. A pharmacist I knew through a cycling group mentioned that certain medications were becoming difficult to source, though not impossible, not yet. At a staff lunch, someone joked that the city's disaster plan should probably include a section titled, "What if Amazon stops coming?" and everyone laughed with more force than the joke deserved. The organism received its common name in January, Pelagomyxa ferrugivora. The news anchors shortened it to ferrugivora within a day, then to ferrugo by the end of the week, as if familiarity could reduce danger. Ferrugo bloomed beneath coatings and inside microfractures. Ferrugo tolerated darkness. Ferrugo survived scraping, freezing, heat treatment, chemical washes, and pressure variations better than expected. Ferrugo did not eat metal in the way headlines claimed, but headlines preferred hunger to chemistry. The first time I saw high-resolution footage of it, projected on a screen in the Emergency Operations Center beneath City Hall, I felt a revulsion so quiet it was almost reverence. Under magnification, the organism moved like pale smoke trapped in water, branching and folding into itself with no visible purpose beyond expansion. It was blind, mindless, ancient-looking, and new. It had no opinion about us. It had not declared war. It did not know what a ship was. It simply touched the things we had made to cross the sea, and those things began to fail. By February, every department had been ordered to complete a dependency review. This sounds simple until you understand that modern government depends on almost everything. Public works needed replacement pumps, valves, asphalt additives, road salt, fuel, tires, filters, machine parts, traffic signal components, batteries, software licenses, laptops, radios, protective clothing, paper, disinfectant, and the small specialized hardware nobody remembers until it breaks. Parks needed greenhouse supplies, irrigation parts, mower components, fuel, seed, tools, fencing, lumber, and plant material. Fire services needed breathing apparatus parts, medical supplies, hoses, foam, radios, uniforms, and vehicle maintenance components. The planning department needed very little physically, which made us feel almost virtuous until we remembered that our entire purpose was to shape a city whose material basis was becoming uncertain. We could continue approving developments, but who would deliver the steel? We could revise housing targets, but who would supply the electrical components, windows, mechanical systems, elevators, fasteners, appliances, membranes, insulation, and pipe? A city is not built from policy. It is built from matter. Matter has to arrive. The first dependency meeting in our department lasted 4 hours and produced a spreadsheet so large it became unusable before it was complete. We sat around a table with laptops open, naming things that came from elsewhere. At first, the exercise felt almost clerical. Then it became philosophical. Where did concrete admixtures come from? Where did the parts for the buses come from? Where did the parts for the machines that repaired the buses come from? How much of local food was truly local if the fertilizer, equipment, packaging, refrigeration, and fuel were imported? How long could water treatment continue if specialized membranes or chemicals were delayed? How many emergency generators relied on parts manufactured overseas and shipped across oceans? Someone asked about bicycles, and the active transportation planner, who had spent years arguing that bicycles were the answer to half the city's problems, stared at his screen and said most bicycle components came from Asia. Nobody laughed. The jokes had begun to leave us. Working in government during the early months of a catastrophe is not like the movies. No one runs through corridors. No one overturns tables. There are agendas, action items, minutes, revised minutes, confidential annexes, briefing notes, and carefully worded summaries for elected officials. There are meetings about whether to call something a shortage, a disruption, a constraint, or a temporary market adjustment. There are people who become more useful under stress and people who become devoted to process because process is the last stable ground beneath their feet. There are senior managers who ask excellent questions and politicians who ask the questions their constituents will ask later, only louder. There are staff who keep working with a steadiness that looks like denial but may actually be courage. There are printers that jam at the worst possible moments. There is always coffee. There is never enough time. And through it all, the thing outside the building keeps happening, whether or not the correct departments have been consulted. By March, the first empty shelves appeared in stores, but never enough to justify panic on their own. That was the strange genius of the collapse. It did not present itself whole. It arrived as missing brands, delayed prescriptions, rising prices, canceled sailings, smaller menus, construction pauses, longer waits, quiet substitutions, back-ordered parts, and apologetic signs taped to doors. The mayor's office asked us for language about resilience. Communications asked whether we had photographs of community gardens. Economic development asked whether local manufacturers could pivot to essential goods, a word that became heavier each time it was used. The province asked municipalities to identify potential sites for expanded warehousing, emergency food distribution, temporary repair yards, and intensified local production. At one meeting, a federal official spoke about regional self-sufficiency corridors, and I wrote the phrase in my notebook, then underlined it twice because it sounded like something from a future that had already given up on the present. One evening, after a 12-hour day, I walked down to the inner harbor instead of going home. It was cold and wet, the kind of Victoria rain that seems less to fall than to occupy the air. Lights trembled on the water. The legislature glowed behind me with its ornamental certainty. Across the harbor, masts tapped softly in the marina. A gull stood on a piling with its head tucked into its feathers, patient and indifferent. I watched a small workboat move slowly past the docks, its engine low and steady. And beyond it, the dark water opened toward the Strait, toward the Pacific, toward all the routes by which we had mistaken distance for inconvenience. I thought then of the maps in our office, the clean lines of ferry routes and shipping lanes, the arrows showing movement, access, exchange, growth. I had spent my career drawing futures on paper. I had believed, without saying so, that the world beneath those drawings would hold still long enough for our plans to matter. The next morning, an updated advisory arrived from the province. Furugo had been detected in low concentrations in several North Pacific monitoring stations. There was no immediate threat to coastal operations, the advisory said. Enhanced inspection protocols were recommended. Further guidance would follow. I printed the advisory, though I do not know why. Perhaps paper made it seem less fluid. Perhaps I wanted something I could hold. I stood by the printer as the pages came out warm and slightly curled, and through the window beyond the cubicles, I could see a strip of gray sky over the rooftops, and beyond that, though not visible from where I stood, the water. Always the water. I placed the advisory in a blue folder marked Marine Logistics, Preliminary, and carried it to the morning briefing. Everyone was already there. The city manager sat at the head of the table. The emergency coordinator had 3 phones in front of her. The finance director looked as though he had not slept. Someone had brought muffins. Someone else had written supply chain response framework on the whiteboard in neat blue letters. I took my seat, opened my notebook, and uncapped my pen. Nobody said apocalypse. Nobody needed to. The meeting began at 8:03. The first thing I learned about a slow-moving catastrophe was that governments measure time differently than ordinary people. Outside City Hall, people counted days until their next grocery trip, until payday, until the ferry reservation they hoped would still exist, until their child's prescription could be refilled, until a delayed package finally arrived. Inside City Hall, we counted briefing cycles, procurement updates, cabinet announcements, shipping advisories, infrastructure assessments, and revised projections. Every morning began with a meeting about what had changed overnight somewhere else in the world, because Victoria was never the beginning of the story. We were almost always the place where consequences arrived after traveling thousands of kilometers across oceans. We had spent 2 centuries teaching ourselves to trust. I had once believed geography was a city's greatest advantage or disadvantage. I was beginning to understand that logistics had quietly replaced geography without anyone noticing, and now logistics itself was dissolving beneath our feet. By April, the planning department no longer spent much time discussing the things planners usually discussed. Housing targets still existed, at least on paper, but developers were quietly withdrawing projects because suppliers could no longer guarantee delivery dates for structural steel, elevators, electrical switchgear, windows, HVAC systems, or even specialized fasteners. A 12-month construction schedule had become an exercise in optimism rather than management. During one particularly awkward meeting, a developer apologized for postponing a 500-unit apartment project indefinitely. No one criticized him. We all knew he wasn't canceling because interest rates had changed or because financing had fallen apart. He simply had no reliable way of knowing whether half the building could actually be built. It struck me then that modern construction depended less on concrete and cranes than on confidence. Every project assumed tomorrow's shipment would arrive because yesterday's shipment always had. Confidence, I realized, was itself an imported material. The city's Emergency Operations Center, buried beneath City Hall, gradually became my second office. It had always existed for earthquakes, tsunamis, major storms, or hazardous material incidents, events that arrived suddenly and demanded immediate coordination. It had never really been designed for something that spread through spreadsheets and shipping schedules. Every wall held large digital displays showing maps, weather, ferry status, utility infrastructure, emergency contacts, and resource inventories. Over the weeks, those displays slowly changed. Weather maps disappeared first, replaced by international shipping density charts. Then global port status maps appeared. Then satellite imagery of major anchorages around the Pacific. At first glance, nothing looked alarming. Thousands of ships still floated on blue oceans. It was only when someone overlaid historical traffic densities that the silence became visible. Vast stretches of sea that had once resembled highways at rush hour now contained scattered, hesitant movements, vessels following increasingly cautious routes, pausing longer in ports, entering dry docks for inspections that often revealed damage no one had anticipated. One Tuesday morning, a marine engineer from Transport Canada addressed us through a secure video conference. His office overlooked Vancouver Harbor, though none of us paid much attention to the scenery behind him anymore. We watched his face instead. Government employees become remarkably skilled at reading faces because official language rarely carries the whole truth. He explained that Furugo had now been identified in every major ocean basin. Researchers believed the organism reproduced through microscopic dormant structures that adhered not only to ships but also to floating debris. Marine mammals, commercial fishing gear, ballast systems, ocean currents, and possibly even migratory seabirds. Every proposed containment strategy had failed before implementation. Dry docks had become overwhelmed. Shipyards worked around the clock replacing hull sections that showed fresh degradation before repairs were complete. Experimental coatings delayed colonization by days or weeks instead of years. New alloys showed promise until they encountered slightly different seawater chemistry. Every scientific success lasted just long enough to become tomorrow's disappointment. Someone from Public Works asked the question everyone had been quietly avoiding. If repairs can't keep up, how many vessels are we actually losing? The engineer hesitated, not because he lacked the number, but because numbers become political once spoken aloud. "We're not losing all of them," he said carefully, "but commercial fleets are shrinking faster than replacement capacity." "How much faster?" Another pause. "The current estimate is approximately 3 vessels permanently withdrawn from service for every one entering operation." Nobody wrote anything for several seconds. It was an oddly human silence, as though each of us had instinctively tried performing the arithmetic before allowing ourselves to feel it. 3 disappearing, 1 replacing, repeat. No presentation slide was needed after that. By early May, our meetings acquired a rhythm I had never experienced before. The same people sat around the same tables asking increasingly impossible questions with extraordinary professionalism. Could local agriculture expand quickly enough to compensate for interrupted imports? Perhaps partially. Could Vancouver Island manufacture critical replacement components? A few, certainly. Could alternative shipping methods compensate? Limited quantities, extremely expensive. Could military logistics fill civilian gaps? Briefly. Could air freight replace maritime cargo? Only for the smallest fraction of global trade. Every answer contained qualifications that sounded encouraging until someone calculated actual volumes. Humanity had not built container ships because they were convenient. We had built them because nothing else approached their efficiency. Remove them, and the arithmetic of civilization simply stopped balancing. I often found myself staring at maps during those meetings. Wall-sized maps, beautiful maps. They showed highways, railways, airports, ports, pipelines, municipalities, watersheds, electrical grids, evacuation routes, zoning districts, ferry terminals, and industrial lands. They looked comprehensive. They looked authoritative. Yet, increasingly, they reminded me of anatomical diagrams after the patient had already died. The roads were still there. The railways remained. Airports functioned. Cities continued occupying the same places. But the invisible circulatory system that connected continents had begun quietly collapsing, and no map maker had ever developed a symbol for that. The public remained remarkably calm. Looking back, that surprises me more than anything else. News broadcasts discussed shipping disruptions every evening. Economists appeared on television explaining freight markets. Scientists gave interviews describing Farugo's biology with admirable honesty and diminishing optimism. Politicians promised international cooperation. The stock market fluctuated violently but continued opening every morning as though routine itself possessed restorative powers. Restaurants shortened menus without explanation. Grocery stores quietly expanded shelf space devoted to locally produced goods. Pharmacies apologized for longer wait times. Hardware stores placed handwritten notices beside empty shelving. None of these changes, taken individually, suggested the end of anything. They suggested inconvenience. Human beings possess an astonishing ability to normalize gradual deterioration, provided it occurs slowly enough. One afternoon, I visited Ogden Point with a transportation engineer to review potential emergency logistics modifications. The cruise terminal stood strangely empty for that time of year. Usually spring brought increasing numbers of visitors, buses, taxis, luggage carts, and excited conversations in half a dozen languages. Now, gulls wandered across wide expanses of concrete as though reclaiming territory temporarily borrowed by humans. The engineer measured turning radii for heavy trucks while I studied the harbor. Offshore, several cargo vessels sat motionless at anchor awaiting inspection before continuing north. Through binoculars, we could see maintenance crews suspended along one hull inside hanging platforms, cutting away damaged plating that had been installed less than a year earlier. Their welding torches flashed briefly against gray steel before disappearing behind drifting rain. From that distance, they resembled surgeons operating on a patient who refused to stop bleeding. "What do you think?" the engineer asked. I looked at the ships. "I think they're buying time." He nodded without asking who I meant. Later that evening, I drove home along Dallas Road. The Strait of Juan de Fuca stretched westward beneath low clouds, calm enough to appear almost artificial. Cargo ships still moved across the horizon, though fewer than I remembered. For years, I had barely noticed them. They had been background scenery, permanent features of coastal life like lighthouses or rain. Now I found myself counting every silhouette. 5 heading east, 2 westbound, 1 tug, a Coast Guard vessel. I couldn't have explained why counting mattered. Perhaps I believed numbers would reveal a pattern before official reports did. Perhaps I simply wanted reassurance that movement still existed. My wife asked over dinner whether work had become any easier. I surprised myself by laughing. "Easier? You've been quiet?" "I spend all day planning a future that keeps changing." She nodded thoughtfully. "Hasn't that always been your job?" I started answering before realizing she had asked a far better question than most people at City Hall. Yes, that had always been my job. The difference was that the future used to move more slowly than the planning documents. Now, it moved faster. Weeks later, the province instructed every municipality to identify facilities suitable for long-term food storage, equipment refurbishment, regional manufacturing, and emergency housing for displaced workers from affected industries. The request was practical, detailed, and quietly extraordinary. I reviewed industrial land inventories, warehouse vacancies, transportation corridors, utility capacities, and zoning restrictions. Every recommendation I wrote assumed conditions would continue worsening. That realization stayed hidden beneath administrative language. We no longer planned for recovery. We planned for adaptation. No policy explicitly acknowledged that transition, yet everyone around the table seemed to understand it simultaneously. One evening, after everyone else had left, I remained alone in the planning office updating infrastructure dependency maps. Outside, downtown Victoria shimmered beneath another steady rainfall. Office towers reflected across wet pavement. Buses still passed. Restaurants still served dinner. Couples still walked beneath umbrellas. Civilization looked perfectly intact from 4 stories above the street. Then my phone vibrated. It was an automated notification from the Provincial Emergency Coordination Network. International Shipping Insurance Consortium suspends new ocean hull policies for high-risk routes, effective immediately. I read it twice. Insurance. Not biology, not engineering. Insurance. The organism had reached another layer of civilization. For months, we had discussed damaged ships. Now we were discussing whether anyone would insure the ships that remained. I turned toward the window again. Far beyond the city lights lay the Pacific, invisible beneath darkness. Somewhere beyond that darkness, thousands of crews were still crossing oceans because the world depended on them doing so one more time. Somewhere, welders worked beneath floodlights, replacing steel already beginning to fail. Somewhere, marine biologists peered into microscopes searching for a weakness that perhaps did not exist. Somewhere, another government planner was probably sitting alone beneath fluorescent lights, updating another spreadsheet that assumed next month's deliveries would be smaller than this month's. For the first time since the advisories had begun, I found myself wondering whether history would eventually describe these months as the beginning. Or whether, years from now, historians would decide the beginning had occurred much earlier, on some forgotten stretch of ocean where a microscopic organism had quietly attached itself to a steel hull, while humanity remained busy congratulating itself on how completely it had conquered distance. By June, I had stopped asking people how they were doing because the answers had become strangely detached from the question. Busy, someone would say, after spending an entire morning trying to determine whether the city's emergency generators could still be maintained without imported electronic control modules. Pretty good, another would answer, despite having just learned that a wastewater treatment upgrade might be delayed indefinitely because specialized filtration equipment was sitting inside a warehouse in Singapore with no insured vessel willing to transport it across the Pacific. We had all developed a new conversational dialect in government. It wasn't dishonest exactly. It was protective. We continued describing our emotional state with words that belonged to the world before Farugo because none of us had yet invented the vocabulary for what was replacing it. Anxiety suggested something temporary. Stress implied relief might eventually arrive. But there is another feeling, quieter and more persistent, that settles into institutions when every report confirms the last report, and every projection becomes obsolete only because reality has deteriorated faster than expected. I began thinking of it as administrative gravity. It pulled every meeting downward, no matter how optimistic the agenda appeared at the top of the page. The city manager started holding executive coordination meetings every morning at 7:30, an hour before most staff arrived. The conference room overlooked the inner harbor, and for the first few weeks I found myself distracted by the view, searching almost unconsciously for reassurance in the movement of vessels. Then, one morning I realized I had been staring at the harbor for nearly 5 minutes because nothing had moved. The ferries were tied to their terminals, awaiting scheduled departures. A Coast Guard cutter sat motionless near the breakwater. Several tugboats floated quietly against their docks. The water itself looked almost polished beneath the overcast sky. It was beautiful in the way abandoned things sometimes become beautiful, stripped of purpose until only their appearance remains. The city manager noticed me looking. "Quiet," he said. "It is." I used to complain about ship noise. So did I. Neither of us smiled. The meetings themselves had acquired a grim efficiency. We no longer spent time debating whether the situation might improve. That discussion had ended without anyone officially declaring it over. Instead, each department summarized new vulnerabilities discovered during the previous 24 hours. Engineering reported growing shortages of replacement transformers and electrical switchgear. Parks informed us that irrigation equipment suppliers could no longer guarantee deliveries for next season. Fleet services warned that maintaining municipal vehicles would become increasingly difficult as inventories of specialized components declined. Finance presented revised cost projections that seemed to increase every week despite increasingly conservative assumptions. Emergency management briefed us on provincial coordination efforts, while communications described public sentiment with phrases like measured concern, rising uncertainty, and localized frustration. I found those descriptions oddly comforting. They sounded almost clinical, as though emotions themselves could be categorized into manageable planning documents. One Wednesday morning, representatives from the federal government joined us in person. Their arrival transformed the atmosphere before anyone spoke. They carried identical black binders, wore nearly identical expressions, and introduced themselves with titles that emphasized coordination rather than authority. One had spent his career in transportation policy. Another specialized in national infrastructure resilience. The third represented Public Safety Canada and spoke very little. We gathered around the long conference table while coffee cooled untouched in paper cups, and after the usual introductions, the transportation official stood beside the screen and displayed a satellite image of the Pacific Ocean at night. At first, I thought the image was malfunctioning. Vast areas appeared unusually dark. "This," he said quietly, "is commercial shipping density 18 months ago." The slide changed. "This is last night." The difference was almost impossible to absorb. The familiar luminous corridors stretching between Asia and North America had thinned dramatically. Not disappeared. Not yet. But where countless moving lights had once formed broad ribbons across the ocean, there were now scattered threads separated by immense darkness. Nobody asked if the image was accurate. Nobody questioned the methodology. We all recognized what we were seeing because each of us had already been living inside smaller versions of the same pattern. The official enlarged the North Pacific. Shipping companies are concentrating remaining vessels on routes with the highest probability of successful completion. What determines that probability? Someone asked. He looked toward the marine scientist accompanying the delegation. The scientist adjusted his glasses before answering. We're not entirely certain. That sentence settled over the room with extraordinary weight. We've identified environmental factors that appear correlated with slower colonization rates, but they're inconsistent. Temperature explains some variation. Salinity explains some. Nutrient concentrations explain some. Ocean currents explain some. None explain enough. So you can't predict where Farugo will spread. We can estimate, but not predict. No. Silence returned, not the uncomfortable silence of disagreement, the exhausted silence of professionals reaching the edge of knowledge. The scientist continued anyway. Some vessels remain remarkably clean. Why? We don't know. Others deteriorate very quickly? Yes. Why? We don't know that either. I watched him while he spoke. There was no embarrassment in his voice, only fatigue. Scientists are accustomed to uncertainty. Governments are not. Governments exist to reduce uncertainty into policies, regulations, budgets, and procedures. Farugo seemed almost uniquely designed to resist that transformation. Every answer remained provisional. Every model required revision. Every recommendation included caveats that grew longer each month. After the meeting, I walked with the transportation official through the corridor outside the council chambers. He paused beside one of the large historical photographs lining the wall. It showed Victoria's harbor around 1910, crowded with steamships, sailing vessels, warehouses, rail spurs, and workers loading cargo by hand. My grandfather worked on ships, he said unexpectedly. So did mine. He studied the photograph. They thought the oceans connected the world. They did. He shook his head gently. No. Ships connected the world. The distinction lingered with me long after he left. Over the following weeks, that idea began appearing everywhere once I started looking for it. Newspapers still referred to global trade as though it floated naturally across oceans, but it never had. It floated across steel, engines, navigation systems, insurance contracts, maintenance schedules, dry docks, financing arrangements, satellite communications, trained crews, spare parts, and millions of ordinary decisions made by people whose names almost nobody knew. We had mistaken the sea for the system because the actual system had always been invisible. By midsummer, Victoria itself remained orderly. Tourists still wandered Government Street, though noticeably fewer arrived by cruise ship. Cafes remained open. Buses operated on schedule. Garbage trucks collected refuse every week. Schools announced plans for September. If someone had spent only an afternoon downtown, they might have concluded the crisis existed mostly on television. City Hall told a different story. Entire floors had begun reorganizing around continuity planning. Meeting rooms disappeared beneath maps, inventory lists, dependency matrices, procurement forecasts, utility diagrams, demographic projections, and handwritten notes taped hurriedly beside digital displays because events were changing too quickly for polished presentations. The photocopiers ran almost continuously, despite years of encouraging paperless government. People trusted paper again. Computers required networks. Networks required electricity. Electricity required equipment. Equipment required parts. Paper required almost nothing except hands willing to carry it. One afternoon, I found our archives manager wheeling several carts stacked with oversized planning maps toward a secure storage room. What are those for? Regional infrastructure copies. We already have digital versions. I know. She smiled faintly. It's beginning to feel irresponsible having only one way of remembering things. That sentence disturbed me more than I admitted. Remembering, not storing. Remembering. Language itself had begun quietly adapting to the new world. Late in July, I accompanied a provincial delegation to inspect several industrial properties that might eventually be converted into regional manufacturing facilities. One of the sites overlooked the harbor from a weathered warehouse whose upper windows had not been cleaned in years. Dust softened the afternoon sunlight into pale gray bands across the concrete floor. We walked through empty loading bays, discussing electrical capacity, heavy floor loading, ventilation systems, rail access, and possible production layouts. Somewhere nearby, a forklift started briefly before falling silent again. During a break, I wandered toward one of the broken windows overlooking the docks. Below me stretched row after row of shipping containers. Thousands of them, blue, red, gray, orange, neatly stacked, perfectly ordinary, except they weren't moving. The cranes above them remained motionless. The trucks were absent. No reversing alarms echoed across the yard. No diesel engines idled. No workers shouted instructions. The containers had become less like freight than geological formations, layers of a civilization paused between one movement and the next. For reasons I still cannot fully explain, that view unsettled me more than any presentation or scientific briefing ever had. Movement had always disguised dependency. Stillness revealed it. When I returned to City Hall that evening, the emergency coordinator handed me a newly arrived provincial directive. We'll need your department to start reviewing neighborhood-level resilience. What does that mean? We're still defining it. I skimmed the document while standing in the hallway. Potential local food production, walking access to essential services, community gathering spaces, decentralized storage, emergency water distribution, adaptive land use, neighborhood repair capacity, local energy generation. The list continued for 7 pages. I looked up. This isn't disaster response. No. It's redesigning cities. I think so. Neither of us said the obvious conclusion aloud. We weren't planning for recovery anymore. We were beginning to imagine permanence. That night, I drove home along the waterfront once again. The strait lay almost perfectly calm beneath a low ceiling of clouds, blending sea and sky into a single endless shade of blue-gray. Far offshore, one cargo ship crossed slowly toward Vancouver, its navigation lights faint against the gathering darkness. I watched it until it disappeared beyond Trial Island. For most of my life, ships leaving the horizon had represented certainty. Somewhere beyond sight lay another port, another crew, another cargo, another schedule, another predictable exchange between distant places. Now every departing vessel felt less like commerce than an expedition. Not because the ocean had become more violent, because it had become unknowable. And as I continued driving through streets that still looked exactly like the city I had always known, I found myself wondering whether the true beginning of an apocalypse was not when familiar things disappeared, but when they remained exactly where they had always been, while the invisible relationships that gave them meaning quietly dissolved beyond the horizon. August arrived with an unusual stretch of clear weather, and for reasons I still cannot explain, the sunshine made everything feel worse. Rain had always given Victoria a certain softness, a willingness to forgive unfinished things, but bright skies exposed the city with uncomfortable precision. The harbor sparkled. Parliament buildings reflected perfectly across calm water. Tourists still wandered the inner harbor carrying ice cream cones and shopping bags. Buskers played violins beneath hanging flower baskets, while horse-drawn carriages rolled past as though history itself had decided to reenact a more optimistic century. If someone had arrived from another country that morning, they would have concluded they had found one of the most peaceful cities in North America. They would have photographed the float planes landing beside the Empress Hotel, admired the sailboats drifting beyond Laurel Point, perhaps complained about the price of coffee, and returned home, believing the news had exaggerated everything. I had begun to understand that civilization often looked healthiest immediately before one noticed what had quietly disappeared. By then, my mornings had become almost mechanical. I arrived before 7, parked in the underground garage beneath City Hall, nodded to the same security guard whose smile had become increasingly automatic over the preceding months, rode the elevator to the 4th floor, and walked through an office that somehow managed to be both busier and quieter than it had ever been. The planners still occupied the same cubicles. The same maps hung on the walls. The same printers hummed. Yet conversations had changed. Nobody asked about vacation plans anymore. Nobody talked about remodeling kitchens or ordering new vehicles or finally taking that cruise through Alaska after retirement. The future had become shorter. We spoke about next week's council meeting, next month's procurement review, whether diesel allocations would remain stable through autumn, whether local farmers anticipated a good harvest, whether another ferry schedule revision had been announced overnight. Human beings, I discovered, unconsciously reduce the distance of their hopes when uncertainty expands faster than confidence. At 7:30, the executive briefing began, and the Emergency Operations Center had acquired the atmosphere of a place that no longer expected to close. Someone had brought in additional desks. Extra communication equipment lined one wall. Portable whiteboards covered with handwritten notes stood beside digital displays because electronic dashboards could not be updated as quickly as people could write. The room smelled faintly of coffee, printer toner, warm electronics, and the stale air of a building occupied too many hours each day. The emergency coordinator joked one morning that we should probably install bunk beds. Nobody laughed. We all considered the suggestion for a fraction of a second before realizing we were considering it seriously. The provincial update that morning lasted only 12 minutes, yet I can remember almost every sentence. Furugo had now been confirmed on every inhabited continent. Several of the world's largest shipbuilding nations had announced emergency programs to accelerate construction using experimental materials, though none had demonstrated significant improvement over conventional steel. Global dry dock capacity had become so overwhelmed that some vessels were waiting 4 months simply for inspection. Maritime insurers had withdrawn from additional trade corridors. Naval forces from several countries had begun escorting strategically important cargoes, not because of military threats, but because losing a single functioning bulk carrier now represented an economic shock large enough to justify armed protection. It struck me as profoundly strange that the world's navies, built over generations to defend nations from one another, had gradually become guardians against biology. After the briefing, I remained behind with Charlotte Muir from the province. We had developed the sort of professional familiarity that only exists during prolonged crises. We rarely discussed our personal lives. There simply wasn't enough unused emotional space left for ordinary conversation. "Have you noticed," she asked quietly while gathering her papers, "that nobody asks when this will be over anymore?" I looked around the nearly empty operations center. They stopped asking. When? I thought about it. I don't know. Neither do I. She slid several folders into her briefcase. It worries me. The acceptance? No. She paused. The speed. That stayed with me for the rest of the day. Acceptance, not surrender, acceptance. Entire governments had quietly crossed an invisible psychological boundary without ever announcing that they had done so. Late that morning, I attended what was officially called the Municipal Land Use Adaptation Working Group, though everyone had already shortened it to the Adaptation Group because titles inevitably become more efficient as crises lengthen. Representatives from agriculture, engineering, utilities, parks, transportation, housing, emergency management, and public health crowded into one of the larger committee rooms overlooking Centennial Square. I had chaired dozens of planning meetings throughout my career, but this one felt fundamentally different before anyone spoke. Normally, planners begin with growth, population, development, demand, expansion. This meeting began with subtraction. Which services might disappear, which industries could no longer be assumed, which imported materials should be treated as permanently unavailable, what infrastructure would become impossible to maintain. How should zoning evolve if neighborhoods needed to become more self-sufficient? The questions themselves revealed that our assumptions had changed more completely than any official declaration could have expressed. One of the agricultural specialists projected a map showing every piece of land within municipal boundaries capable of producing food under intensive cultivation. The map was discouraging. Victoria had never intended to feed itself. Neither had Vancouver, neither had Seattle. Neither had almost any modern city. Urban planners had spent generations separating food production from population because transportation had made proximity unnecessary. Now, transportation itself had become uncertain. "We're not trying to become self-sufficient," someone said. "No," replied the agricultural specialist. "We're trying to become less dependent." The distinction seemed almost philosophical. Later that afternoon, Finance presented revised municipal revenue forecasts. Construction activity was slowing. Property transaction volumes were declining. Commercial vacancy rates had begun increasing. Fuel costs continued climbing. Procurement expenses were becoming almost impossible to predict. Every department had requested contingency funding simultaneously. I watched the finance director work through spreadsheet after spreadsheet, calmly explaining assumptions that grew steadily more pessimistic with each page. Numbers possess their own emotional temperature. Optimistic budgets feel expansive. Balanced budgets feel reassuring. These numbers felt cold, not dramatic, not catastrophic, simply cold. At one point, the city manager interrupted. "What's our greatest financial risk?" The finance director answered without looking up. "Planning for recovery that never comes." The room became very quiet. He continued. "If we assume trade returns within 2 years and invest accordingly, we could bankrupt ourselves preparing for a world that no longer exists." No one challenged him. Government meetings often contain disagreements. This one contained recognition. That afternoon, I walked across the street to a grocery store during lunch simply to observe. Planning teaches you to watch before drawing conclusions. The shelves remained mostly full. Customers moved normally through the aisles. Cashiers chatted politely. Children asked parents for candy. Nothing resembled panic. Yet once I began looking more carefully, the changes accumulated. Entire brands had vanished. Imported fruit occupied much smaller displays. Several refrigerated sections contained handwritten notices explaining temporary supplier interruptions. The seafood counter displayed fewer varieties than I had ever seen. The international foods aisle looked strangely hollow. One employee removed price labels while another immediately replaced them with higher ones. Nobody complained. That unsettled me more than shouting would have. People were adapting faster than I had realized. When I reached the checkout, the young cashier smiled. "Did you find everything?" For a moment I almost answered honestly. No, none of us had. Instead, I nodded. "Close enough." Walking back toward City Hall, carrying a small paper bag, I noticed something else. Delivery trucks. Or rather, their absence. Normally, downtown Victoria functioned like a carefully choreographed dance of commercial vehicles. Delivery vans, beverage trucks, produce suppliers, maintenance contractors, courier services, linen companies, construction suppliers, postal vehicles, and wholesalers constantly moved through the narrow streets. Now there were noticeably fewer, not empty, just fewer. The city itself seemed to breathe more slowly. That evening, I stayed late preparing recommendations for council regarding industrial land preservation. Only a year earlier, developers had argued that several aging warehouse districts should be converted into mixed residential neighborhoods with cafes, offices, and waterfront apartments. The proposals had seemed sensible then. Now they appeared almost reckless. Warehouses had become strategic assets. Repair shops had become strategic assets. Machine shops, fabricators, storage yards, industrial electricians, metal suppliers, every unfashionable business that cities had gradually pushed toward their edges had suddenly become indispensable. I wrote sentence after sentence recommending protection of lands that, only months before, many considered underutilized. Halfway through the report, I stopped typing. I realized I was not writing for the council sitting in Victoria. I was writing for a city that did not yet exist. Outside my office window, evening sunlight reflected from the harbor in long ribbons of gold. A lone tugboat moved slowly toward Esquimalt, leaving barely a ripple behind it. Beyond the breakwater, the Strait of Juan de Fuca stretched toward the Pacific, calm enough to appear almost innocent. It occurred to me then that Farugo had never announced itself. There had been no declaration, no invasion, no enemy fleet appearing over the horizon, no dramatic moment when civilization understood what was happening. Instead, millions of perfectly rational people had each adjusted to one small inconvenience after another. A delayed shipment, a postponed project, a missing product, a revised forecast, a canceled sailing, an unavailable part. Each change seemed manageable by itself. Only when viewed together did they form something immense. That realization frightened me more than the organism itself, because organisms behave according to biology. Civilizations behave according to stories. And I was beginning to suspect that ours still believed it was living inside the wrong one. When I finally left City Hall just after 8 o'clock, the streets were nearly empty. Warm summer air drifted inland from the harbor, carrying the familiar scent of salt, kelp, diesel, and creosote from old pilings baking in the afternoon sun. The city sounded different now that traffic had diminished. Individual footsteps echoed farther. Conversations carried across intersections. Somewhere, a church bell marked the hour with unusual clarity. I stood for a few minutes beside the waterfront before walking to my car. Across the harbor, the cranes at Ogden Point stood perfectly still against the fading orange sky. Months earlier, I had thought of them as monuments. Now they reminded me of clocks, not because they measured time, because they no longer moved, while everything that truly mattered continued changing around them. I drove home, wondering whether future historians would describe our downfall as a biological disaster, or whether they would simply write that one day the oceans stopped behaving like roads, and humanity had built almost nothing else. September arrived with the first hint of autumn in the air, and I noticed the season less by the changing leaves than by the arrival of budget meetings. Every municipality has its rituals. Spring belongs to development applications and construction schedules. Summer belongs to infrastructure projects racing against good weather. Autumn belongs to finance. Departments gather around conference tables to negotiate the future one line item at a time. Each convinced their priorities are essential because, from where they sit, they usually are. For most of my career, those meetings had been tedious, occasionally frustrating, and almost always grounded by a shared assumption that next year's city would resemble this year's city closely enough for comparison to remain meaningful. That assumption disappeared during the first budget session, though no one announced its departure. We simply discovered, one agenda item after another, that nearly every financial model we possessed had quietly become historical. The finance department had abandoned its customary 5-year forecast. Instead, the director projected 3 scenarios labeled optimistic, constrained, and severe continuity, names so carefully chosen that they almost concealed what they represented. The optimistic scenario assumed global shipping stabilized at approximately 60% of its previous capacity. The constrained scenario assumed further losses before equilibrium. The severe continuity scenario assumed no meaningful stabilization at all, only continued adaptation to declining maritime transport. I found myself studying the names more than the numbers. Nobody had titled a scenario "Recovery." Nobody had called one "Return to Normal." Even language had begun protecting itself from disappointment. The finance director, Graham Sutherland, was not a dramatic man. He had spent nearly 30 years explaining municipal budgets with the calm precision of someone who believed arithmetic should never be emotional. Yet that morning, standing beneath fluorescent lights with a remote control in one hand and a stack of annotated spreadsheets in the other, he looked older than I remembered. His tie hung slightly crooked, and he paused between slides more often than usual, as though giving the room additional time to absorb figures that refused to become less alarming simply because they were expected. "Our revenues remain relatively stable for the moment," he said. "Our expenditures do not." The slide behind him showed 3 lines diverging steadily apart. "We can reduce discretionary spending." He clicked again. "We can postpone capital projects." Another click. "We can defer maintenance." Again. We cannot postpone dependency. That sentence settled over the room with remarkable force. I wrote it in my notebook immediately. We cannot postpone dependency. It sounded less like accounting than philosophy. He began listing examples: replacement pumps for water infrastructure, electrical switchgear, specialized bearings, traffic signal controllers, wastewater treatment membranes, emergency vehicle electronics, fire apparatus components, communications equipment, laboratory reagents, industrial lubricants, computer hardware, generators, medical supplies. Some remained available. Many required longer lead times. Others had become impossible to source with any confidence. The problem, Graham explained, was no longer simply higher prices. It was probability. You can budget for expensive. He looked around the room. You cannot budget for unavailable. Nobody disagreed. As planners, we spent our careers assuming that almost any problem could be managed through enough coordination, consultation, and long-term thinking. That confidence had not entirely disappeared, but it had become noticeably quieter. We were beginning to encounter questions that had no procedural solution. A week later, the province convened what became known informally as the Island Continuity Conference. Representatives from nearly every municipality on Vancouver Island gathered inside a convention hall overlooking the harbor. Under ordinary circumstances, the event would have been called a symposium or regional planning forum. Those names implied exploration. Continuity implied endurance. Nearly 300 people attended. Mayors, chief administrative officers, planners, engineers, health officials, police, fire chiefs, harbor authorities, agricultural specialists, utility managers, procurement officers, economists, military liaison officers. The room possessed the peculiar atmosphere of professionals who had all reached the same conclusion independently and were hoping someone else had found a reason to abandon it. The keynote speaker was an oceanographer from the federal government whose research had focused on marine ecosystems long before Furugo became a household word. She was soft-spoken, almost gentle, and entirely free of the theatrical certainty that television audiences seemed to demand from experts. Her first slide displayed not the organism itself, but a satellite photograph of the Earth. "This," she said, "is how humanity has seen the oceans for approximately 500 years." The photograph changed. Shipping lanes appeared across the seas like glowing arteries. "This," she continued, "is how modern civilization actually functions." Another slide. The shipping lanes slowly faded until only continents remained. "We have spent generations believing these blue areas connected us." She let the silence linger. They never did. No one moved. It was the ships. She wasn't telling us anything new, yet hearing it spoken aloud in that room made the realization feel official somehow. The oceanographer spent the next hour explaining everything scientists had learned, and, far more importantly, everything they still had not. Furugo did not appear to possess intelligence. It did not selectively attack ships. It colonized suitable surfaces according to biological processes that remained frustratingly inconsistent. Attempts to eradicate it through chemical treatments had largely failed. Heat treatments worked until reinfection occurred. Experimental polymers slowed colonization in laboratory settings, but proved unreliable under commercial conditions. Some research groups believed the organism communicated chemically, others disagreed. Some believed it had existed unnoticed for centuries. Others argued genetic evidence suggested recent evolution. No consensus emerged. Every answer generated another uncertainty. Near the end of the presentation, someone asked the question that had hovered over every government meeting for months. "When do you expect a breakthrough?" The oceanographer smiled sadly. "I expect many breakthroughs." She folded her hands. "I no longer expect one of them to solve the problem." Driving back to Victoria that afternoon, I found myself thinking about those words more than the scientific details themselves. Many breakthroughs, no solution. Modern civilization had been built on the comforting assumption that sufficiently difficult problems eventually surrendered to engineering. Bridges collapsed until engineers improved bridges. Diseases spread until medicine advanced. Aircraft crashed until aviation became safer. Computers failed until software improved. Again and again, humanity encountered limits only to push beyond them. Farugos seemed to belong to a different category altogether. Not impossible, simply adaptive, as though biology itself refused to remain still long enough for engineering to catch it. Back at City Hall, another change had quietly taken place. The Emergency Operations Center no longer displayed projected shipping recovery dates. I stared at the large digital screen for several moments before asking one of the analysts where they had gone. He looked almost embarrassed. We removed them. Why? They kept changing. So? He shrugged. Eventually, they became misleading. When did you decide that? It wasn't really a decision. He hesitated. We just stopped updating them. There it was again. Not a declaration, a drift. One assumption after another quietly abandoned because reality no longer supported maintaining it. Late that month, I visited the city's public works yard to review possible expansion areas for equipment refurbishment. The mechanics had transformed part of the maintenance building into what resembled an operating theater for machinery. Components once discarded after failure now occupied carefully labeled shelves awaiting rebuilding. Old hydraulic pumps were dismantled, inspected, machined, polished, and reassembled. Electric motors were rewound rather than replaced. Damaged castings were welded, reshaped, and returned to service. The shop supervisor noticed me watching. We're becoming a repair city. I suppose we are. He picked up a worn bearing. 5 years ago, we'd have thrown this away. What about now? He smiled. Now it's inventory. The distinction struck me with unexpected force. Civilizations reveal their confidence by what they discard. They reveal their fear by what they keep. On my way back through the yard, I passed rows of retired municipal equipment awaiting decisions. Old snowplows, dump trucks, generators, street sweepers, compressors, vehicles that had once been scheduled for auction now waited quietly behind chain-link fences because nobody could predict whether some forgotten component might become essential next year. Nothing left. Everything stored. The future had become a salvage operation. One Friday evening, after most employees had gone home, I wandered through the planning department almost absent-mindedly. Desks stood empty beneath fluorescent lights. Coffee cups waited beside computer monitors displaying unfinished reports. Large zoning maps covered conference room walls. Somewhere down the hallway, a photocopier continued humming to itself. I stopped beside one of our oldest planning documents. It was the city's official community plan. Years of consultation had gone into producing it. Population projections, transportation priorities, housing targets, economic strategies, climate adaptation, urban villages, complete communities, everything carefully integrated, everything internally consistent, everything based upon assumptions that had seemed almost timeless. I opened it. The very first pages spoke confidently about continued integration into global trade networks. I closed it again, not because it was wrong, because it belonged to another civilization. Outside, darkness settled over Victoria unusually early beneath gathering autumn clouds. The harbor lights reflected softly across black water while a cool wind carried the smell of salt and cedar inland through the empty streets. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded, a deep, lonely note that lingered far longer than I remembered. I stood beside the window listening. For generations, foghorns had warned ships about hidden dangers. Now they sounded different, not warnings, reminders. Proof that ships still existed somewhere beyond the darkness. I realized then that I had begun measuring hope in increasingly modest ways, not by expecting recovery, not by believing scientists would suddenly discover a cure, not even by assuming next year's budget could be balanced. Hope had become hearing a foghorn at night and knowing another vessel had survived one more crossing. That frightened me more than any government briefing ever had, because I could no longer remember exactly when my definition of normal had become so small. And somewhere beyond the Black Pacific, beneath millions of square kilometers of water that looked exactly as it always had, Furugo continued spreading without urgency, without malice, without intention, quietly rewriting the geography of human civilization one microscopic colony at a time, while governments like mine continued meeting every morning, drafting reports every afternoon, and trying, with remarkable professionalism, to plan a future that was disappearing faster than anyone could print the next agenda. October began with fog, not the theatrical kind that arrives in ghost stories, but the ordinary Pacific fog that slips quietly into Victoria Harbor before dawn, softening lights, swallowing distant buildings, and making familiar places seem to hesitate before revealing themselves. I drove to City Hall through streets that appeared one intersection at a time, the headlights of oncoming cars floating like isolated thoughts inside the gray. It occurred to me that governments function much the same way during prolonged emergencies. Nobody sees the entire crisis. Every department illuminates only the small section directly ahead of it, trusting that someone else is watching what lies beyond the edge of visibility. By then, I had been carrying the same blue binder for nearly 10 months. The label had long since changed. It no longer read Marine Logistics, Preliminary. Someone, perhaps me, though I honestly couldn't remember, had replaced it with a newer tab, Long-Term Continuity. The word preliminary had quietly disappeared. Nobody had authorized that change. Nobody needed to. I reached the Emergency Operations Center shortly after 7. The room no longer resembled an emergency facility. It resembled a permanent ministry that had accidentally been built underground. Additional desks had multiplied until every available corner contained laptops, maps, radios, charging cables, handwritten schedules, stacks of reports, and insulated coffee mugs with names written on masking tape. People who had belonged to different departments a year earlier now worked beside one another so routinely that organizational boundaries had begun dissolving. Transportation staff answered questions from public health. Engineers reviewed reports with procurement officers. Financial analysts sat beside emergency coordinators. Nobody remarked on it anymore. Institutions, I discovered, adapt to crises in much the same way people adapt to injuries. At first, every movement feels unnatural. Eventually, the limp becomes your normal walk. The morning briefing opened with a presentation from the Port Authority. Traffic volume across the harbor had fallen another 12% since the previous month. Fuel deliveries remained stable but increasingly irregular. Commercial fishing activity continued declining because maintaining vessels had become prohibitively expensive. Ship repair requests exceeded available capacity by nearly 400%. Then came a statistic that nobody had anticipated. Average vessel age had begun increasing rapidly. At first, the number puzzled me. Then I understood. Very few new ships were entering service. Existing vessels were simply being repaired, rebuilt, reinforced, cannibalized, and returned to work again and again until there was almost nothing original left inside them. The port director summed it up with a sentence that stayed with me. "We're no longer operating a fleet." He looked around the room. "We're operating survivors." No one interrupted him. Words mattered in government because they eventually found their way into reports, legislation, budgets, and public statements. Once the port director described ships as survivors instead of assets, I noticed similar language appearing elsewhere. Infrastructure became lifelines. Warehouses became reserves. Mechanics became recovery specialists. Scrap became strategic inventory. The vocabulary of abundance had slowly been replaced by the vocabulary of endurance. Later that morning, I attended a meeting that would have seemed absurd only a year earlier. The agenda read, "Potential conversion of municipal parking lots for seasonal food production." As a planner, I had spent decades helping accommodate more vehicles. Now we were discussing potatoes. The Parks Department had produced detailed diagrams showing which asphalt lots might eventually be removed without compromising emergency access. Engineers calculated soil depths required for raised beds. Public Works estimated demolition costs. Water specialists analyzed irrigation requirements. The finance department projected maintenance expenses compared with expected yields. Everything was rational. Everything was carefully researched. Everything would have sounded completely insane to the version of me who had walked into City Hall the previous autumn. Halfway through the meeting, someone pointed toward one of the maps. That's where the overflow parking for cruise passengers used to be. Nobody answered. There hadn't been a cruise ship in Victoria for nearly 4 months, not because Ferrugo made cruise ships impossible, because insurers no longer considered transporting thousands of passengers across the Pacific an acceptable commercial risk. Entire industries were disappearing not through engineering failure, but through actuarial mathematics. During lunch, I walked alone toward the inner harbor. I had developed the habit of doing that several times each week, not because there was anything specific to observe, because I needed to remind myself that the water was real. Government work has a peculiar way of replacing reality with documentation. After enough meetings, graphs begin feeling more substantial than streets. Risk matrices become more tangible than neighborhoods. I worried sometimes that I was slowly losing contact with the physical city I was supposedly helping plan. The harbor looked beautiful, almost painfully so. The Olympic Mountains stood clear across the strait beneath fresh autumn snow. Sailboats drifted lazily in the afternoon breeze. Tourists photographed seals resting on floating docks. Children laughed while feeding gulls despite signs asking them not to. If someone had muted the conversations around me, the entire scene could have belonged to any year of my adult life. Then I noticed the horizon. There were almost no ships. For years, cargo vessels had existed so continuously beyond Victoria that my mind had stopped registering them individually. They formed part of the landscape, as ordinary as clouds. Now, their absence demanded attention. A painter once told me that empty space is never actually empty. It defines everything surrounding it. The empty horizon had become part of the city. That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived from Ottawa. His name was Dr. Elias Fournier, an economist attached to a federal continuity task force. Unlike most economists I had encountered, he carried no laptop into meetings. Instead, he filled small notebooks with remarkably neat handwriting while listening far more than speaking. After everyone introduced themselves, he asked a question so simple that it unsettled the room. "What business is Victoria in?" People answered automatically. Government, tourism, technology, education, marine services, construction, healthcare. He shook his head politely. No. Nobody spoke. He waited. Finally, the city manager asked what he meant. Dr. Fournier walked to the whiteboard. He drew a circle. Inside it, he wrote, "Imports." Then he drew arrows pointing outward. Food, fuel, medicine, building materials, electronics, machinery, replacement parts, chemicals, consumer goods. Finally, he turned back toward us. "Cities don't produce civilization." He tapped the circle. "They consume it." No one moved. "I don't mean that as criticism." He smiled gently. "I mean it as a planning reality." Then he erased the circle. "What happens when consumption is no longer guaranteed?" The meeting lasted another 3 hours. I remember almost none of the discussion, only the question. That evening, I stayed unusually late reviewing land use scenarios. Our department had begun drafting something internally called the 50-Year Continuity Framework. The title alone would have sounded absurd 12 months earlier. Governments rarely planned 50 years into emergencies. Emergencies were supposed to end. Yet there I sat beneath fluorescent lights, helping imagine what Victoria might become if maritime trade never returned to anything resembling its former scale. Neighborhood workshops, local manufacturing districts, expanded food production, repair economies, water resilience, distributed energy, protected industrial lands, reduced dependency corridors. The document read less like urban planning than instructions for slowly becoming a 19th century city equipped with 21st century knowledge. Near 8 o'clock, I wandered into the archives room looking for an older zoning map. Our archivist, Margaret, was still working. She had been scanning engineering drawings from the 1960s. I thought everything had already been digitized. She laughed softly. So did everyone else. What changed? She held up a large blueprint. The originals last longer. There was no drama in her voice, only experience. I helped her carry several boxes toward climate-controlled storage. Most contained paper records older than either of us. Hand-drawn sewer plans, original subdivision maps, bridge calculations, harbor engineering reports. Thousands of decisions made by people who had assumed someone in the future would still need to understand how their city had been built. As we stacked another box onto a shelf, Margaret stopped unexpectedly. "You know what frightens me?" "What?" "They never imagined us." I looked at her. "The engineers?" She nodded. "They planned for bigger cities." She rested her hand on one of the boxes. They never planned for smaller worlds. Driving home that night, I took the longer route along Beach Drive. The moon reflected faintly across calm water. The shoreline houses glowed warmly against the darkness. Families were eating dinner, watching television, helping children with homework, walking dogs beneath maple trees beginning to shed their leaves. Life continued. Ordinary life. That was perhaps the cruelest part of the entire catastrophe. The apocalypse rarely interrupted your evening. It simply changed what tomorrow would contain. At a red light, I glanced toward the harbor once more. One cargo vessel sat at anchor beyond the breakwater awaiting inspection. Its navigation lights shimmered quietly across the black water. I wondered how many welds had already been replaced, how many plates reinforced, how many engineers had signed inspection reports with growing uncertainty, how many crew members now spent more time monitoring hull integrity than navigating oceans. The light turned green. I drove on. Later that night, unable to sleep, I stood alone on the back deck of my house, listening to the distant sounds drifting across the city. A train horn from the mainland, a barking dog somewhere uphill, wind moving gently through cedar branches, then, faintly, a ship's horn, one long note, far away, muted by distance and fog. I closed my eyes and listened until it faded completely. Years earlier, I would have heard nothing more than a vessel announcing its position. Now it sounded different. Not lonely, not frightened, determined, as though somewhere beyond the darkness another crew had decided that this crossing, like all the others before it, was worth attempting despite knowing that the ocean itself had become an adversary no one could negotiate with. Standing there beneath the cold October sky, I realized something I had been avoiding for months. Every report we produced, every contingency plan, every zoning amendment, every emergency budget, every meeting that stretched late into the evening, was buying time for people we hoped would discover an answer. But hope, I was beginning to understand, is a dangerous thing to build policy upon. Because every week the scientists learned more about Farugo. Every week the engineers invented better repairs. Every week governments became more coordinated. And every week there were fewer ships. November arrived with the first real Pacific storms, and I found myself paying closer attention to the weather than I ever had before. For most of my life, storms had simply been interruptions. Ferries might be delayed, a few trees would come down. Public works crews would clear blocked drains while BC Hydro restored electricity to neighborhoods that had briefly gone dark. And within a day or two, Victoria would return to itself as though nothing particularly unusual had happened. But storms meant something different now. Every low-pressure system moving across the Pacific carried another unseen calculation. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships were already crossing open water with hulls that had been patched, reinforced, welded, inspected, patched again, and sent back into service because there were no replacements waiting in dry docks anymore. I often found myself wondering how many captains now feared the steel beneath their feet as much as the weather ahead of them. It struck me that for generations, sailors had learned to read the sea, while now they were being forced to read the ships themselves, listening for unfamiliar vibrations, studying maintenance reports with greater attention than the horizon, trusting engineering that everyone quietly understood was buying time rather than guaranteeing safety. The ocean had not become more violent, it had simply become less forgiving. Inside City Hall, the rhythm of government continued with remarkable determination. The emergency briefings still began before sunrise. Coffee still appeared in paper cups beside thick binders filled with revised procedures. Someone always arrived carrying another stack of reports that had seemed important the previous afternoon, but already required updating before the meeting even began. At first, I had found comfort in the routine. Eventually, I realized the routine existed because institutions cannot survive indefinitely in a state of alarm. They adapt instead. Catastrophe slowly becomes administration. What had once felt extraordinary gradually became another agenda item discussed between infrastructure maintenance and procurement updates. We no longer reacted visibly when another shipping route closed or another insurer withdrew coverage from an ocean corridor. Such announcements received nods, a few carefully phrased questions, and another series of action items. Human beings cannot remain frightened every day for months at a time. Eventually, fear settles into something quieter, something almost procedural, and that transformation worried me more than panic ever could. Panic burns quickly. Procedure can continue indefinitely. One Monday morning, the emergency coordinator distributed another revision of our continuity manuals. I noticed immediately that the binders had grown thicker again, and as I flipped through mine, I found sections that would have seemed absurd only a year earlier. There were inventories of machine shops and welding businesses throughout southern Vancouver Island, assessments of cabinet makers and metal fabricators, directories of retired mechanics willing to return to work, studies examining neighborhood repair capacity, plans for converting underused municipal properties into food production sites, recommendations for recovering usable materials from abandoned industrial equipment, and detailed maps identifying every building that might someday become a workshop instead of an office. As planners, we had spent decades imagining cities becoming cleaner, quieter, more digital, and increasingly service-oriented. Now we were cataloging lathes, milling machines, foundries, blacksmithing equipment, and industrial warehouses with almost archaeological enthusiasm. We were not searching for economic opportunity anymore. We were searching for capability. Somewhere along the way, I realized we had stopped asking what industries Victoria hoped to attract and had begun asking what skills still survived within the people who already lived here. A few days later, I accompanied several provincial officials to a massive warehouse near Esquimalt that had recently been converted into what the government called a Regional Materials Assessment Center. The title sounded technical enough to disguise what the building actually represented. Walking through its enormous doors felt less like entering a warehouse than stepping into civilization's attic. Shelves stretched almost farther than I could see beneath bright industrial lighting. Electric motors sat beside hydraulic cylinders. Transformers rested beside crates of valves, industrial bearings, pressure gauges, gearboxes, steel shafts, copper wire, pumps, compressors, generators, and thousands of components that had once been considered too worn or obsolete to justify keeping. Forklifts moved quietly through the aisles while technicians inspected, cleaned, repaired, measured, cataloged, and tested machinery that only months earlier would almost certainly have been sold for scrap. A young engineer noticed me studying several pallets stacked with aging electric motors whose paint had long since disappeared beneath decades of use. He smiled and said something I never forgot. "We've stopped asking what something was," he explained. "Now we ask what it could become." As I continued walking through the building, I understood exactly what he meant. Every object surrounding me represented postponed replacement. Civilization itself had entered a repair cycle. We no longer assumed tomorrow would manufacture something better. We hoped only that yesterday's machinery might survive one more season. During lunch, I sat beside Linda, one of the province's senior procurement officers, a woman who had spent nearly 30 years negotiating international supply contracts. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly while watching workers move pallets across the warehouse floor before quietly telling me that she had devoted most of her career to making supply chains more efficient. I nodded because, in one way or another, nearly all of us had. We had celebrated just-in-time inventory systems, centralized manufacturing, streamlined logistics, reduced warehousing, and global specialization because every economic model demonstrated they lowered costs. "Do you know what efficiency really means?" she asked without looking at me. Before I could answer, she continued, "It means you've removed every spare future." She counted softly on her fingers as she spoke. Warehouses disappeared because inventory cost money. Backup suppliers disappeared because competition rewarded the cheapest contracts. Local factories disappeared because production could be concentrated elsewhere. Redundancy disappeared because shareholders preferred efficiency over resilience. Every decision had been logical when considered individually. Together, they had created a civilization balanced delicately upon uninterrupted movement across oceans. She finally looked at me and smiled, though there was little amusement in her expression. "We called it progress," she said. After a long silence, she added, "I suppose it was until biology voted." The sentence lingered with me for the rest of the drive back to Victoria. City Hall itself continued changing in subtle ways that outsiders would probably never have noticed. Council meetings became shorter, not because there was less work to discuss, but because the range of genuine disagreement kept shrinking. There had once been passionate debates about preserving industrial land versus residential development, encouraging higher density, supporting manufacturing, protecting green space, expanding transportation infrastructure, and dozens of other competing priorities. Those debates still existed in theory, yet more and more decisions now seemed inevitable. Industrial land would be protected because repair shops mattered more than condominium towers. Community gardens would expand because local food production mattered more than ornamental landscaping. Machine shops, warehouses, electrical contractors, fabricators, plumbers, welders, mechanics, and every unfashionable trade that cities had gradually pushed toward their edges suddenly occupied the center of long-term planning discussions. The crisis had done something decades of planning reports never managed to accomplish. It had reminded elected officials that before a city can become prosperous, sustainable, beautiful, or innovative, it must first remain functional. Later that month, I toured one of Vancouver Island's largest grocery distribution warehouses, expecting to learn about food inventories, but discovering something far more unsettling. At first glance, the building projected abundance. Endless rows of shelving stretched beneath high ceilings while forklifts moved steadily between aisles loaded with canned goods, frozen food, produce, cleaning supplies, paper products, beverages, and every ordinary object that modern life quietly depends upon. But then the warehouse manager opened his inventory software. Every product category glowed green, yellow, or red, according to replenishment confidence rather than stock on hand. "People think shortages begin when shelves empty," he told us while enlarging one section of the screen. "They begin here. Purchase orders, delivery schedules, supplier reliability, insurance availability, shipping probability. Customers would not notice the crisis for weeks because the mathematics failed long before the shelves did. As we walked farther through the building, I noticed employees reorganizing inventory according to irreplaceability rather than product type. Near the loading docks, enormous stacks of damaged wooden pallets waited to be dismantled and rebuilt. When I asked why they were repairing pallets that once would have been discarded without a second thought, the manager simply picked up a cracked board and said, "Now lumber is lumber." Such a simple statement, yet it contained an entire economic philosophy. Value itself had changed. The world was slowly forgetting the difference between old and new. There remained only useful and not yet useful. Toward the end of the month, the city manager asked me to prepare a presentation called Victoria 20 Years from Now. Under ordinary circumstances, I would have relied upon population forecasts, transportation models, housing projections, employment trends, and economic development strategies. Instead, I found myself asking entirely different questions. How much food could be grown within reasonable distance of the city? How many electricians still lived here? How many machinists, welders, nurses, farmers, millwrights, water system operators, mechanics? How much energy could realistically be produced locally? Which industries required imported components that might never again become dependable? Somewhere during those weeks, I realized I was no longer forecasting growth. I was measuring survivability. When I finally presented the report to council, the room remained unusually quiet. Map after map appeared showing neighborhood workshops, protected industrial corridors, expanded community agriculture, repair districts, distributed storage facilities, local manufacturing clusters, and educational partnerships designed to rebuild skilled trades that previous generations had quietly allowed to disappear. Near the end, one counselor looked up from his notes and asked me whether I truly believed this was Victoria's future. I looked through the large windows overlooking downtown. Pedestrians still crossed intersections carrying umbrellas. Buses still followed their routes. Office workers hurried toward coffee shops. The city looked almost exactly as it always had. I believe, I answered slowly, this is the future if the oceans never become roads again. Nobody responded. They didn't need to. Every person in the room understood the sentence. That evening, after the meeting had ended and the corridors of City Hall had grown quiet again, I walked down to the breakwater before driving home. The wind had strengthened, pushing long gray swells across the Strait of Juan de Fuca while heavy clouds rolled in from the Pacific. Far offshore, a single cargo vessel moved steadily eastward, its navigation lights rising and falling with the swell until they almost seemed suspended between sea and sky. I watched it for a long time, wondering how many welds had already been replaced beneath its waterline, how many engineers had signed inspection certificates with growing uncertainty, how many crew members now spent their watches monitoring hull integrity instead of merely navigating the ocean. It was then that I realized I had misunderstood the story for nearly a year. I had imagined Farugo itself was the catastrophe, the organism, the damaged ships, the scientific mystery, the endless government meetings, the shortages, the budgets, the adaptation plans, but standing there with cold spray drifting across the rocks, listening to waves striking a breakwater built by men who had believed the sea could always be crossed, another understanding settled over me with uncomfortable clarity. Farugo was only the opening chapter. The real story was far older than biology. For centuries, humanity had stitched every continent together with ships until oceans no longer felt like barriers, but like empty space waiting to be crossed. We had slowly forgotten that civilization itself rested upon that enormous woven fabric of movement. Now, almost silently, thread by thread, the fabric was beginning to unravel. There were no explosions, no declarations, no single morning when the world announced it had changed forever. There was only a microscopic organism pursuing its own indifferent existence, while humanity gradually rediscovered a truth our ancestors had known instinctively. The oceans had never belonged to us. We had merely passed across them for a little while, mistaking permission for ownership, and nature, with extraordinary patience and absolutely no malice, had quietly reminded us of the difference. December arrived almost unnoticed because by then the calendar had become one of the least important ways of measuring time. We measured our lives in procurement cycles, fuel deliveries, ferry schedules, emergency directives, and infrastructure reports. Christmas decorations appeared throughout downtown Victoria exactly as they always had. The Parliament buildings glowed beneath thousands of white lights, storefronts filled their windows with wreaths and evergreen garlands, and volunteers erected the enormous Christmas tree overlooking the inner harbor, while children pointed excitedly from passing cars. Every year those decorations had reminded me that another year was ending. This year, they reminded me that traditions often survive long after the assumptions that created them have disappeared. Standing outside City Hall one evening watching families wander through the lights, I wondered how many of them understood that nearly every decoration surrounding them had been manufactured somewhere across the Pacific years earlier, imported aboard ships that had crossed oceans so routinely that nobody had ever considered their existence remarkable. We had built entire cultures upon uninterrupted arrival. Christmas itself, I realized, had become another supply chain. Inside government, however, sentimentality rarely survived contact with operational reality. The Emergency Operations Center had now been active continuously for almost a year. Additional ventilation units had been installed because the room never truly emptied anymore. Whiteboards covered entire walls, layered with notes written in different colors that tracked fuel inventories, food reserves, replacement parts, weather systems, ferry operations, healthcare capacity, municipal staffing, industrial production, and hundreds of smaller concerns that had once belonged to separate departments, but now flowed together into a single continuous picture of whether the city could continue functioning tomorrow. I sometimes wondered what a visitor from 10 years earlier would think if they walked through those doors. They would probably assume we were responding to a major earthquake or tsunami. It would be difficult to explain that the emergency consisted primarily of meetings, spreadsheets, shipping insurance, engineering reports, and a marine organism too small for any of us to see. One morning, shortly before Christmas, we received the annual Federal Continuity Assessment. A year earlier, it would have been called an economic forecast. The title alone revealed how completely expectations had changed. Representatives from Ottawa joined us through a secure video conference, though several connections dropped repeatedly because national communications infrastructure had begun suffering from shortages of specialized replacement equipment. Nobody commented on the interruptions. They had become ordinary. The lead analyst, a thoughtful economist named Dr. Elias Fournier, whom I had met several months earlier, began speaking with the same calm, measured tone that had characterized every previous briefing. He displayed graphs showing freight capacity, industrial production, agricultural output, regional manufacturing growth, and demographic movement. Some numbers had improved modestly. Local food production had expanded more rapidly than expected. Repair industries were hiring. Apprenticeship enrollment in skilled trades had nearly doubled across much of the country. Communities had become remarkably innovative at extending the life of machinery once considered disposable. There were genuine successes, and everyone in the room acknowledged them with quiet satisfaction. Then, Dr. Fournier advanced to the next slide. It contained only a single graph: global maritime carrying capacity. The line continued downward, not steeply, not dramatically, simply steadily. Someone asked whether the decline was slowing. "It is," he answered. Another voice asked whether that meant stabilization. He hesitated before responding. "No." The room remained silent. The decline is slowing because fewer ships remain available to lose. No one spoke for several seconds. It was an answer so mathematically simple that it left almost no room for optimism. We had spent months celebrating every improvement in repair techniques, every successful experiment in hull coatings, every new engineering solution. But all of those achievements existed inside a larger equation that continued moving in only one direction. Humanity had become better at preserving ships. Nature remained slightly better at taking them away. After the briefing ended, I stayed behind while most people returned to their departments. Dr. Fournier remained connected to the conference room, organizing papers before his screen went dark. On impulse, I asked him a question I had been carrying for months. "Do you think we're adapting?" He looked at me thoughtfully. "I think we're surviving." "Is there a difference?" He smiled faintly. "There always is." He leaned back in his chair. "Adaptation changes the future." He paused. "Survival postpones it." The connection ended a moment later. I sat alone in the conference room longer than I intended, staring at my reflection in the black monitor after the call disconnected. His distinction disturbed me because I could not decide which category Victoria belonged to. We were repairing more than replacing, growing more than importing, salvaging more than manufacturing, conserving more than expanding. Those sounded like adaptations. Yet almost every major decision we made still carried the unspoken hope that somewhere, somehow, Scientists would discover something that allowed the oceans to become highways again. We were building a different future while emotionally waiting for the old one to return. The planning department received a new assignment just before the holidays. Council wanted a complete review of every industrial property that had been rezoned during the previous 25 years. At first, the request seemed oddly specific until I understood its purpose. For decades, cities throughout North America had converted warehouses into condominiums, machine shops into cafes, factories into office buildings, rail yards into entertainment districts, and working waterfronts into parks. Those decisions had often been sensible. Land values changed, economies evolved, manufacturing moved elsewhere. Nobody had imagined that elsewhere might someday become unreachable. I spent days reviewing aerial photographs that documented the city's gradual transformation. One image after another showed industrial neighborhoods shrinking while residential developments expanded into spaces once occupied by fabrication shops, marine repair businesses, warehouses, and freight yards. Looking backward through those photographs felt strangely like reading someone's diary while already knowing how the story would end. Every decision had made perfect sense when it was made. None had anticipated Farugo. History rarely punishes people for making irrational choices. More often, it punishes them for making reasonable choices under assumptions that later prove incomplete. A week before Christmas, I visited the harbor with one of our engineering managers to inspect several municipal waterfront facilities. A light snowfall had begun falling across the city, unusual enough that pedestrians stopped to watch flakes drifting onto the dark water before melting almost immediately. The harbor looked extraordinarily peaceful. A few ferries continued operating. Tugboats moved deliberately between docks. Seagulls floated effortlessly upon the tide as though nothing at all had changed. Yet the engineering manager pointed toward a line of weathered warehouses along the waterfront. Those used to annoy me. Why? They were old. He laughed softly. I wanted modern buildings. And now? He watched the warehouses for several moments. They have cranes. I followed his gaze. Most of the buildings did indeed possess aging overhead cranes, heavy timber construction, loading doors large enough for machinery, thick concrete floors, rail access, storage yards, and repair space. They had survived because nobody had found them attractive enough to demolish. It's funny, he said quietly. What is? We spent 30 years trying to become a post-industrial city. He shook his head. Turns out, industry didn't get the memo. That sentence stayed with me because it summarized something I had been noticing throughout government. The future we had imagined before Farugo now felt oddly fragile, dependent upon uninterrupted abundance, while the older infrastructure built by previous generations kept proving unexpectedly valuable. Blacksmith shops reopened, machine shops expanded, technical colleges added welding programs faster than they could hire instructors. Retired millwrights suddenly found themselves teaching apprentices half their age. Skills that had seemed destined for museums became strategic resources almost overnight. Progress, I was beginning to suspect, was not always a straight line. Sometimes it resembled a spiral, carrying forgotten knowledge back into the center of civilization when circumstances changed. Christmas itself passed quietly. My family gathered as we always had, though gifts were noticeably fewer and more practical than in previous years. Nobody complained. Conversations drifted naturally toward gardens, repairing household appliances, preserving food, neighborhood tool-sharing groups, and relatives entering skilled trades. These were not subjects anyone would have considered especially interesting a few years earlier. Now they occupied the center of ordinary conversation. Watching my nieces and nephews laugh together around the dinner table, I experienced an unexpected mixture of comfort and sorrow. Children adapt with astonishing speed. They accept the world presented to them without mourning the one that existed before they arrived. It was the adults who carried the weight of comparison. When I returned to work after the holidays, another package awaited me on my desk. It contained revised population projections prepared jointly by the province and several universities. I expected to see familiar charts showing steady growth across southern Vancouver Island. Instead, the report described something entirely different. International immigration had slowed dramatically as maritime movement continued contracting. Population growth had shifted toward regions capable of greater agricultural self-sufficiency. Some large metropolitan areas were beginning to shrink for the first time in generations, while smaller resource communities stabilized or even expanded. Mobility itself had become more limited. People moved less frequently because replacing jobs, housing, equipment, and community connections had become more difficult in a world where distance once again carried real economic weight. Near the end of the report, one sentence had been highlighted for municipal planners. The planning assumption of continuous expansion should no longer be considered universal. I read the sentence several times. For nearly a century, planning schools had taught us to manage growth. Roads widened, utilities expanded, housing increased, commercial districts intensified. Everything pointed toward larger populations and greater complexity. We had developed sophisticated models describing how cities grow, almost none describing how they endure. That evening, I remained alone in the planning office until well after dark. Snow had turned briefly to rain, leaving the streets below shimmering beneath amber streetlights. Somewhere down the hallway, a cleaning cart rolled slowly across polished floors, while the ventilation system hummed steadily above the ceiling tiles. My desk was covered with maps showing neighborhoods, industrial lands, transportation corridors, utility systems, and emergency facilities. I had spent nearly my entire professional life believing those maps represented the city. Slowly, I had come to understand that they represented only its skeleton. The real city consisted of relationships too complicated to draw. Farmers connected to wholesalers, wholesalers connected to ports, ports connected to ships, ships connected to manufacturers, manufacturers connected to mines, forests, refineries, engineers, mechanics, insurers, navigators, financiers, and millions of people who would never meet one another despite depending upon each other's work every single day. Ferrugo had not attacked the city itself. It had attacked those relationships. The buildings still stood exactly where they always had. The streets remained. The parks remained. Even the harbor remained as beautiful as ever. What had changed was the invisible web of trust, movement, and expectation that transformed geography into civilization. Before leaving for the night, I walked once more to the fourth-floor window overlooking downtown Victoria. A light fog had begun drifting inland from the harbor, softening the city lights until every street seemed to disappear gently into the next. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay the Pacific, immense and indifferent, carrying the same tides that had reached these shores for thousands of years before human beings ever imagined container ships or global trade. For the first time since the crisis began, I found myself wondering whether history might someday describe our era not as the age when shipping ended, but as the brief historical moment when humanity believed the oceans had permanently stopped being oceans. That thought stayed with me all the way home. Because if that was true, then perhaps Ferrugo had not changed the world at all. Perhaps it had simply ended a remarkably fortunate exception. January began with an unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of empty streets, because Victoria was still alive. Buses continued running. Schools reopened after the holidays. Cafes filled each morning with office workers carrying steaming cups through the damp winter air. Children hurried across crosswalks wearing oversized backpacks, while commuters complained about traffic exactly as they always had. On the surface, almost everything that made the city recognizable remained intact. The silence, I noticed, belonged to expectation. For more than a year, every briefing had contained some version of the same hope: that another research laboratory had discovered a promising coating, that another consortium of shipbuilders had developed a stronger alloy, that another international task force believed a breakthrough might finally be within reach. Those updates had become less frequent, then shorter, and eventually they disappeared altogether. Nobody announced that they had disappeared. They simply stopped arriving. Government has a remarkable ability to recognize the difference between uncertainty and resignation without ever using either word. One morning, I realized that the scientific section of our daily briefing had been reduced to 2 sentences summarizing maintenance improvements. No one asked whether a cure remained possible. We had quietly reached the point where asking the question felt almost impolite. The Emergency Operations Center reflected that change more clearly than any report. A year earlier, the walls had displayed world maps covered with colored indicators showing the spread of Farugo across the oceans, the status of international shipping lanes, the location of affected ports, and projections prepared by scientific advisory panels. Most of those displays had disappeared. In their place were maps of Vancouver Island, southern British Columbia, and western Canada. Local food production, electrical transmission, fuel storage, municipal repair capacity, rail movements, regional inventories, emergency manufacturing. The world's oceans had slowly vanished from our planning screens, not because they no longer mattered, but because we had exhausted our ability to influence them. Governments eventually concentrate on the problems they can still solve. Everything else becomes weather. I remember one particular morning with unusual clarity because it seemed, at the time, almost insignificant. The city manager entered the operations center carrying a folded newspaper, something he rarely did anymore. He placed it on the conference table before the briefing began. No one looked at it immediately. We all assumed it contained another story about shipping losses or food prices. After everyone had settled into their seats, he quietly unfolded it and turned the front page toward us. The headline announced that one of the world's largest container shipping companies had entered formal liquidation after suspending operations indefinitely. I recognized the company's name instantly. Their vessels had once seemed almost omnipresent in every major port on Earth. Their containers had passed through Victoria by the thousands without any of us giving them a second thought. Now, the article described auctioning terminals, dismantling logistics software, selling maintenance equipment, and laying off generations of employees whose professions had quietly ceased to exist. No one discussed the article during the meeting. There wasn't much to say. The city manager folded the newspaper again and set it beside his binder. Then he began reviewing municipal water infrastructure. That, more than anything else, captured the strange emotional landscape of government during a prolonged collapse. The extraordinary never replaced the ordinary. It simply settled on top of it. Entire industries disappeared while someone else discussed storm drain maintenance. Global maritime commerce unraveled while parks requested funding for tree pruning. Civilization contracted, yet payroll still had to be processed before Thursday. A few weeks later, I attended what had once been called the Annual Economic Development Forum. The title had survived, although the conference itself had become something entirely different. Years earlier, the presentations would have celebrated investment, tourism, technology, international partnerships, export opportunities, and population growth. This year, economists spoke about regional resilience, localized production, vocational education, repair capacity, agricultural diversification, and material recovery. The vocabulary of expansion had given way to the vocabulary of stewardship. During one presentation, an economist projected a graph showing global economic output over the previous 20 years. Everyone expected to see the sharp decline that had followed Farugo. Instead, the graph revealed something stranger. The decline had already stopped. Economic activity had stabilized, not because shipping had recovered, because humanity had lowered its expectations. I found that realization deeply unsettling. One attendee asked whether stabilization should be considered encouraging. The economist thought for a long moment before answering. It depends. On what? Whether you mistake adaptation for recovery. Those words echoed through my mind for days afterward. We had become increasingly skilled at maintaining aging machinery. Communities had reorganized around local production. Skilled trades were flourishing again. Food systems had become more regional. Waste had declined dramatically because almost everything found a second or third use. If someone looked only at the graphs, they might conclude civilization had adjusted remarkably well. But graphs never mourn. They never show abandoned ports. They never record professions that quietly disappeared. They never measure possibilities that future generations would never know had once existed. Toward the end of January, I received permission to tour the Port of Vancouver as part of a regional planning delegation. The ferry crossing itself felt strangely subdued. Years earlier, the Strait of Georgia had almost always contained cargo vessels waiting to enter Burrard Inlet, ferries passing in opposite directions, fishing boats, tugs towing barges, and distant ships moving steadily toward the Pacific. Now, vast stretches of water appeared almost empty. I stood outside, despite the cold, watching the horizon for nearly the entire crossing. Occasionally, another vessel appeared far away, moving deliberately as though every journey had become something to be considered carefully rather than simply undertaken. The port itself astonished me. It was not abandoned. In some ways, that would have been easier to understand. Instead, it continued functioning with extraordinary discipline beneath an entirely different set of assumptions. Cranes still loaded cargo. Rail yards remained active. Trucks entered and departed through security gates. Workers moved with the practiced confidence of people who understood their jobs completely. Yet every conversation returned eventually to the same subject: preservation. Nothing moved unnecessarily. Nothing waited outdoors longer than required. Maintenance schedules had become almost obsessive. Every available dry dock operated continuously. Entire teams existed solely to inspect hulls before damage became catastrophic. One supervisor explained that modern ports no longer measured success primarily by throughput. "We measure survival." The sentence sounded so familiar that I realized I had begun hearing variations of it everywhere. Survival of fleets, survival of infrastructure, survival of neighborhoods, survival of institutions. Humanity had unconsciously redefined success without ever voting to do so. While walking along one of the container terminals, I noticed row after row of cranes extending above the waterfront like enormous steel skeletons. Several remained active. Others stood permanently idle because there were simply not enough ships left to justify operating every berth. Rust had begun appearing on sections of machinery that once moved almost continuously. Seagulls nested comfortably atop floodlights, overlooking silent loading areas. Weeds pushed through cracks in pavement designed for traffic that no longer existed. It looked neither ruined nor prosperous. It looked paused. That distinction troubled me because pauses imply continuation. Instinctively, people still spoke about the day activity would return. I wasn't sure anyone actually believed it. Back in Victoria, the planning department had begun drafting what eventually became known as the Permanent Continuity Framework. The title generated remarkably little discussion. 2 years earlier, it would have sparked political controversy. Now, it passed through committee almost unnoticed. Reading the draft, I recognized how profoundly our profession had changed. The document contained almost no references to international trade. Instead, it emphasized neighborhood resilience, regional manufacturing, repair economies, watershed protection, agricultural land preservation, apprenticeship programs, and strategic material reserves. We were no longer planning a city connected seamlessly to the world. We were planning a city capable of standing largely on its own. One afternoon, while reviewing historical land use maps, I came across a planning report written nearly 80 years earlier. It described Victoria as a regional service center supporting the surrounding agricultural communities. I smiled unexpectedly. For decades, planners had considered that description outdated. Now it felt almost prophetic. History has an odd sense of humor. It rarely repeats itself exactly. Instead, it waits patiently until civilization circles back toward problems its grandparents quietly understood. Late one evening, after everyone else had gone home, I wandered into the archives room looking for several engineering drawings referenced in an older infrastructure report. Margaret, our archivist, was still there, carefully restoring brittle maps that had begun deteriorating with age. We spoke for a while about nothing particularly important before she asked whether I had noticed something about government documents written before the middle of the 20th century. "They're shorter," I guessed. She smiled. "That too. What else?" "They assume less." I looked at her curiously. "They don't assume electricity." She reached for another document. "They don't assume instant communication." Another. "They don't assume imported materials." She folded the fragile page gently. "They describe how things work." She looked toward the rows of shelving surrounding us. We spent the next 80 years describing how efficiently they worked. Driving home that night through steady rain, I kept thinking about her observation. Perhaps that was what had really changed. Modern civilization had become so successful that we stopped documenting fundamentals. We documented optimization instead. We assumed ships would exist. We assumed parts would arrive. We assumed growth would continue. We assumed complexity would always increase because complexity itself had become evidence of progress. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, a ship's horn echoed across the dark water. Just one, long, low, patient. I pulled my car onto a quiet overlook above the harbor and listened until the sound disappeared into the rain. The city lights shimmered across the water while fog drifted slowly between anchored vessels waiting for inspections before continuing their journeys. I realized I could no longer remember the last time I had seen two cargo ships passing each other in the strait. There had once been so many that no one noticed them. Now I could remember each one individually. As I sat there watching the harbor, another thought emerged so gradually that I almost missed it. For nearly 2 years, I had believed I was helping the city of Victoria survive an unprecedented emergency. But perhaps emergencies are defined by their endings. Perhaps what we were living through had already crossed into something else entirely. Not disaster, not recovery, not even adaptation. A new civilization, one that had not been chosen, one that had not been designed. One assembled quietly from repair manuals, zoning amendments, salvaged machinery, careful budgeting, patient craftsmanship, and millions of ordinary people continuing to do their jobs with remarkable professionalism long after the world those jobs had been created for had disappeared. The rain continued falling. The harbor remained calm. Beyond the darkness lay the Pacific, unchanged in every way that mattered to nature. Only humanity had changed. And for the first time since that forgotten memo had arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning almost 2 years earlier, I found myself wondering whether future generations would find our stories difficult to believe, not because Farrugo had destroyed the age of global shipping, but because there had once been a time when ships crossed every ocean on Earth in such unimaginable numbers that people stopped looking up when one passed over the horizon. It has been 5 years since the first memorandum arrived in my inbox. I still have it. The paper has yellowed slightly around the edges from being handled too often, and the blue folder that once carried the optimistic label Marine Logistics, Preliminary, has long since become so worn that the corners have separated from the cardboard beneath. Sometimes, during quiet moments at the office, I take the folder down from the shelf and read those first pages again. They have acquired the strange quality that all historical documents eventually possess. Every sentence remains technically correct. Every recommendation was sensible. Every precaution was reasonable. Yet nowhere inside those carefully worded paragraphs is there the slightest understanding of what they were actually describing. It was not the beginning of a shipping disruption. It was the beginning of the end of an age. I still work at City Hall. That surprises people when I tell them. There were moments during those first years when many of us quietly wondered whether municipal government itself might become irrelevant, swept aside by provincial emergency powers or national continuity authorities as the crisis deepened. Instead, almost the opposite happened. The farther the world contracted, the more important cities became. Decisions that had once been made in distant corporate headquarters or international ministries gradually returned to local councils, engineering departments, water operators, public works supervisors, agricultural cooperatives, neighborhood associations, and planning offices like mine. We did not become more powerful. We simply became closer to the consequences. There is a profound difference between writing policy for millions of people and helping decide which abandoned warehouse should become a machine shop, which parking lot should become farmland, which stormwater pond can also serve as emergency irrigation, or which retired mechanic should teach apprentices, because no textbook contains everything he knows. Governments never stopped functioning. They merely shrank until they could once again recognize the faces of the people they served. The planning department occupies the same floor it always has, although very little inside resembles the office where I began my career. Half the cubicles disappeared years ago, replaced by long work tables covered with physical models, engineering drawings, material samples, hand-marked maps, seed catalogs, utility schematics, and repair manuals. The printers still run constantly, though now they produce far more paper than reports. We have learned not to depend entirely upon digital archives. Our planning library has become one of the busiest rooms in the building, and young planners spend as much time studying century-old infrastructure drawings as they do reviewing satellite imagery. Universities have changed as well. Students entering planning programs no longer begin with urban growth models. They begin with watersheds, soils, local industry, food systems, maintenance, and the mathematics of endurance. Somewhere along the way, planning quietly stopped asking how cities become larger. It began asking how they remain alive. Sometimes, visitors from other regions ask whether Victoria was fortunate. It is a difficult question to answer. Compared with many places, yes. We still have abundant fresh water. Good agricultural land lies within reasonable distance. Hydroelectric power continues flowing from the mainland, though across a transmission system maintained with almost religious dedication. Our climate forgives mistakes that colder places cannot afford. The surrounding forests still provide timber. The sea still provides fish, though not nearly as generously as before. We were fortunate, but fortune has become a relative thing. No city escaped unchanged, not one. A few months ago, I attended a conference in what used to be Vancouver's Convention Center. The building remains magnificent, though the subjects discussed inside would have bewildered the delegates who attended conferences there a decade earlier. Nobody spoke about globalization. Nobody discussed international competitiveness. The keynote presentations focused instead on regional metallurgy, freshwater resilience, biological materials research, long-term maintenance engineering, apprenticeship systems, and agricultural soil recovery. During one panel discussion, an economist displayed a graph showing global trade volumes before Farugo and after. The audience studied it politely for a few moments before turning their attention to a presentation about rebuilding municipal machine shops. The graph represented history. The machine shops represented tomorrow. What strikes me most now is how quickly memory fades. There are young engineers working beside me who barely remember container ports operating at full capacity. Several of our newest planners were children when Farugo first appeared. They listen politely when older staff describe grocery stores overflowing with imported fruit in the middle of winter or online orders arriving from another continent within days. But I can see the same expression on their faces that I once wore while listening to my grandfather describe steam locomotives. They believe us because we have photographs. Without the photographs, I sometimes wonder whether they would. Extraordinary normality becomes mythology with astonishing speed. The harbor has changed in ways that visitors notice immediately and residents no longer consciously see. The great container cranes still stand at Ogden Point and across larger ports farther north and south, but many have not moved in years. Some have been carefully preserved because dismantling them would require resources better used elsewhere. Others have been converted into observation towers, maintenance platforms, communications masts, or simply left standing because nobody possesses a compelling reason to remove them. Children ask their parents what they were for. Parents explain as best they can. The answers become shorter every year. Languages evolve around absences. Eventually, even memory becomes economical. A surprising number of ships still cross the Pacific, far fewer than before, enough to remind us what was once possible. They travel slowly now, following carefully monitored routes, carrying cargoes selected with extraordinary deliberation. Every voyage matters, every hull inspection matters, every departure attracts attention that once would have seemed absurd. I still find myself stopping beside the waterfront whenever I hear a ship's horn. Old habits remain long after the circumstances that created them have disappeared. Sometimes I stand there for several minutes watching a single freighter work its way through the Strait of Juan de Fuca until it disappears beyond the horizon. 5 years ago, I would not have noticed. Today, almost everyone nearby stops to watch. Farugo itself never went away. That fact surprises newcomers more than anything else. They expect history to conclude with a cure because that is how stories usually behave. The organism remains in every ocean, still adapting, still frustrating laboratories across the world. Scientists have learned enough to slow it, predict some of its behavior, and design vessels capable of surviving longer than those built during the early years of the crisis. They have become extraordinarily skilled at living with Farugo, not defeating it, living with it. There is wisdom hidden inside that distinction. For centuries, we believed progress meant eliminating limits. Perhaps maturity means recognizing which limits belong to the world rather than to ourselves. Every now and then, I revisit one of the city's oldest planning maps, the one hanging outside council chambers with bright red lines radiating confidently across the Pacific toward Asia and beyond. The map has never been removed. Some people suggested replacing it after the crisis, arguing that it represented an obsolete worldview. I disagreed. It deserved to remain exactly where it had always been, not because it still described reality, but because it reminded us how completely reality can change while coastlines remain exactly the same. The map was never wrong. It merely belonged to a brief historical interval during which humanity mistook extraordinary success for permanent law. This afternoon, I walked once again to the fourth-floor window overlooking downtown Victoria. Rain drifted gently across the harbor, just as it had on the morning when the first memorandum arrived years ago. The buses continued moving through the streets below. Cyclists waited patiently at intersections. Office workers hurried beneath umbrellas carrying coffees back toward buildings that had survived not because they were modern, but because generations of maintenance crews refused to let them fail. Somewhere nearby, I heard the steady tapping of construction hammers. They no longer built towers nearly as often. More frequently, they repaired roofs, strengthened foundations, restored workshops, expanded greenhouses, or converted another forgotten warehouse into something useful. The city still changed. It simply changed more slowly, and with greater humility. I have often wondered what future historians will call our era. The end of global shipping, the Farugo crisis, the Great Contraction, the Age of Repair. Perhaps all of those names will appear in different textbooks. If they ask me, I would choose none of them. I would call it the rediscovery of distance. Because that was what really happened. The oceans never closed. The continents never drifted farther apart. No mountain ranges rose from the sea. No earthquakes split the earth. The planet itself remained astonishingly constant. Only one assumption disappeared. For nearly 2 centuries, humanity believed that distance had become an accounting problem, something measured in fuel costs, insurance premiums, and delivery schedules. We forgot that geography had merely been waiting patiently beneath our confidence, unchanged since long before the first ship ever crossed an ocean. Farugo did not create that geography. It simply removed the illusion that we had escaped it. As for me, I remain what I have always been, a city planner. There is something strangely comforting about that. My profession survived because every generation, no matter what world it inherits, eventually has to decide where roads should go, where homes should be built, how water should be managed, which land should be protected, and how neighbors can continue living together without exhausting the place they share. Those questions are older than empires and will almost certainly outlive whatever civilization comes after ours. This evening, before leaving the office, I opened the window slightly despite the cold January air. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, beyond the Parliament buildings, beyond the quiet harbor and the breakwater, I heard a ship's horn carrying across the strait. One long, steady note echoed through the mist before fading into the rain. I stood there listening until there was nothing left to hear. Years ago, that sound would have disappeared beneath hundreds of others. Tonight, it traveled alone. And somehow that seemed appropriate, not because it was lonely, but because it reminded me that civilization has never really been measured by the number of ships crossing an ocean. It has always been measured by the people who continue repairing the harbor after most of those ships are gone. That, more than anything else I witnessed during these years, is what I hope history remembers. Not our fear, not our shortages, not even Farugo. I hope it remembers the planners who kept drawing maps, the mechanics who refused to discard broken machines, the welders who rebuilt impossible hulls, the farmers who coaxed harvests from neglected fields, the teachers who passed forgotten skills to children, the archivists who preserved old drawings because someone might need them again, and the thousands of ordinary public servants who arrived every morning carrying coffee and binders into meeting rooms, believing that careful work still mattered even after the world they had trained for quietly slipped away. Because in the end, that was the only cargo that never stopped moving.